I'd be interested to just understand from your perspective what a good PMO should be doing around scope for any portfolio of programs or projects.
With regard to scope, there's a number of things that are, I think, really important here. The first thing is we've recovered programs that have gone wrong. 9 times out of 10, there are 4 or 5 fundamental issues, and one of them is the definition and the mobilization of the program in the first place. People jump into delivery too quickly. I often use the analogy of a house. It's a bit like someone putting all the materials that it takes to build a house around a hole in the ground. And then the person who's looking for the house to be built saying, okay, well, let's get going. And everyone diving for their materials and just starting to do things. You get the roof being built before the foundations are in, you get the walls being built, and everything, it just doesn't tie in. So that's why you have architects' drawings that determine and get signed off for what it is that you're building. And scope is no different. If you get that bit right at the front end of a program, your chances of success, your delivery certainty goes up immensely, hugely. So, number one, defining scope at the front end. I would say that as important as defining what's in scope is being clear about what is out of scope. So when we do a program mobilization package of work, we tend to be very clear about both what's in scope and what's out of scope. They're two separate things, so that there's no, as far as possible, there are no foggy edges. It's very clear what's in scope. Now the world changes, as we know, in the lifetime of a program. It just does. Look at Brexit, look at GDPR, look at this pandemic that we've been in recently. It can change overnight. So you have to be able to change scope based on all sorts of factors. But the key thing there is having a simple and a manageable change control mechanism so that scope changes can be impact assessed, preferably as simply as possible, and then either accepted or rejected. And then I think the third real factor with scope is making sure that the sponsor of a program, a leader of the organization, understands their accountability for ensuring that scope doesn't creep. Because often it's the sponsor that actually drives scope creep. And actually, it should be the other way around. The sponsor should be the guardian, as much as the program manager and the PMO. The sponsor should be the guardian of that scope and ensuring that if it is going to change, it's changed via a controlled process with proper decision making and governance around it. Scope is key. And the PMO should have every possibility to drive the right processes in order to make sure that that happens.
And Rupert, what's the most extreme case of scope creep that you've seen, and what did that teach you?
One that springs to mind immediately, actually interestingly, is an organization that was implementing a PPM tool, project and portfolio management tool. So not dissimilar to KeyView Perform, but it was one of the big ones. And in year one, they tried to define through the PMO, significantly, the portfolio office, what they wanted to achieve. And the scope of that included so many of the modules. So things like capacity and demand planning, resource module, finance module, a portfolio optimization and prioritization module. And what they really did was they sat in the chair and they were thinking, we're PMO experts, so we want to get the most out of this system. So we'd like to stretch it to its limits and get the best possible functionality out of it. What they didn't do was look at the organization itself and say, what is the organization actually capable of? So firstly, they spent probably about 18 months trying to implement phase one of the rollout of this tool. They never actually managed to achieve that because they could never get the data that needed to be input. They couldn't get it in. And the reason they couldn't get it in was because there were many moving parts that were stopping that being possible. There was like a 12-13% attrition rate. So of all the people they trained, within 12 months, 12% of them had gone, and another load had come in who didn't know the system. There were external contractors who were being asked to use the system. They didn't understand the system, they didn't know it. So you've then got another 20% of your flexible resource that couldn't use the system. And we actually got involved with them probably about 3 years downstream. They were about 3 years, even possibly even more, into their life with this tool. And they had spent millions of pounds on implementation, getting the consultants, expensive consultants, to come back in and do reconfiguration work, etc. And they had never managed to get that system in and working. There was one element that they did get working, which was timesheet reporting. Well, timesheet reporting is such a fraction of what a PPM tool can potentially do that it was just such limited value. They had made the mistake of not determining some deliverables in the short term. So there was no momentum. I would say within 6 months, the organization had lost, and the leadership of the organization had lost confidence, and there was no momentum in that program at all. It had completely gone because people stopped believing it was going to actually happen. And once they stop believing it's going to happen, people run for the hills. They don't want to know. They don't want to be involved in something that's not going to succeed. So, if you looked at the business case for that example, where it was on year minus 6 months, it was pretty compelling. If you looked at the actual, what had been spent and what value had been derived 4 years later, it was virtually nothing. It was huge cost, huge effort, virtually no benefit at all, apart from timesheet recording. How many hours have you spent working on this project this week? That was just a particularly bad example of where scope had gone all over the place, and they defined the scope incorrectly in the first place. It was totally out of sync with the capability of their organization.